Secretary of US EPA, Environmental Protection Agencies. He was a branch chief and acting division director. He obtained his BSc in physics and MSc in biophysics from the University of Bombay. He completed a one-year postgraduate training in radiological physics from BARC. Then he joined BARC as a scientific officer and worked for about 2 years before leaving for US for further higher studies. He was born in Palakkad, raised in Mumbai, Chembur area, and currently lives in Cary, North Carolina. In addition to his scientific activities, he is the prime mover. He is concerned into philanthropic sectors also. He is the prime mover of Chaitanya Institute, which serves more than 100 plus children suffering from autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, mental retardation, etc. This is in Palakkad. He makes it a routine every year to visit this institute to study status, working status, and suggest any improvement if needed. The mothers of the children are given vocational training as a part of strengthening the family financially. Dr. Ram collects funds, visit almost yearly, as I told. As an aside, in the brief span of 2 years, he found a bride too in his colleague Ram Ramabhadran, Nee Joshi, in BRC. The topic of the seminar is a bit controversial. However, it is interesting. He is going to explain the contrarian view of climate change. We are always irradiated with climate change is going to cause great catastrophe, and that is one view. But there could be a different view in any aspects. So, with this, I conclude, and I request Dr. Bhadran to start the seminar.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be speaking to you about a subject that I've gotten into very many arguments, but I stopped arguing. That's why I said in my seminar, this will not be a debate because it's an endless debate. So I'm going to just give you a perspective from the other side, and it is for you to judge what to believe, what not to believe. And with that caveat, I will begin my presentation. So what I'd like to do is just give you a brief rationale for this presentation. Then I would like to state some disclaimers, positions, and some shared assertion with the opposite side. Then I would like to deal with the overarching philosophy of the alarmists, activists, and press, and of course, Al Gore. I hope you all know him. There's a myth of a consensus that 97% of the scientists believe in man-made climate change. I just want to dig a little bit into that to tell you what it means, really. It's used by Obama and everybody to claim legitimacy for all the scare that one gets. Then the opposing sides of the debate. Who are on this side of the debate, and what are the perils they're facing for being in that position? Then we move to the science. Is man-made CO2 the whole story? Then, of course, everybody has heard about IPCC. It's an organization with a bias. I will show you why I think so. And is it really a scientific body, or is it an intergovernmental law firm? I will explain that too. The IPCC produced a lot of models, and many of them make predictions that are dire and are not being observed. Then, of course, we have UN climate treaties that everybody makes a lot of noise about, and I'll dwell on that. And then, what do the alarmists want, and what consequences will it have on the rest of the world? And then I'll briefly touch on a couple of technologies, carbon capture and other things briefly. And then guilt and atonement with climate colonialism. In other words, the treaties are basically saying that we have West agrees that we have polluted a lot, and so we want to do something about it. But some of the activists, what they want to do goes far beyond what can be done now, and it will have impact on the developing world. And then I'll just briefly tease you, atomic energy people, with a few alternatives for India, and then I'll leave you with some points to ponder. So that's the plan. So I'll take the first two sections, okay? The rationale for this presentation is climate change catastrophes are being constantly drummed up by activists who are abetted by the, sensationalist media. The prescription proffered by the alarmists are based on what is termed consensus science. I hate consensus science because it's not always the best, where they claim 97% of the scientists support their pronouncements of urgency. Alarmists claim that the current science-based predictions portend dire consequences, including extinction of humans, unless urgent action is undertaken at a global level. Urgent solutions proposed to alleviate the problem appear to be knee-jerk reaction that might occlude and imperil responses to other major challenges facing humans. So in this presentation, I will examine the verity of the claims and solutions from a perspective of scientists and policymakers who advocate a measured approach by examining the scientific uncertainties in the purported cause, validity of the catastrophic predictions, inadequacies of the remediation proposal, especially their impact on the developing world. So my disclaimers are this: I'm a retired scientist, as I was introduced. I am a molecular biologist. I'm not a climate scientist. One of the important things when you go for a discussion with climate scientists is they will tell you first thing, you're not a climate scientist. I don't know who is one. They come in various, I think, but and also I think these scientists have a hubris that only scientists can know things. There are a lot of other smart people in the world, and we need to concede that. They didn't choose science because they could make more money somewhere else, but there are other smart people. So when you go into a debate with a climate scientist, are you a climate scientist? No, I'm not. Then I won't talk to you. Okay. I'm concerned about the impact of the alarmism on my own grandchildren. You will see in a minute why it is so. And on the developing world of my origin. I still have family in India, and what happens in India is still important to me. I'm concerned with the misuse of science to serve political goals that could cause harm to the world, especially to the poor of the world. So based on the title of this presentation, I will present only a one-sided view. Please accept that. I'm not going to present any opposing data or mitigating data. Again, as I said, I will clarify but not debate any issue in this presentation because it'll be an endless back and forth. There are some things that everybody agrees. Energy derived from fossil fuels has been very important to us over the last century. It's pulled so many people out of poverty, and it has avoided the Malthusian catastrophe. This was proposed by Ehrlich, which has affected India in many ways during even the British rule. Let them die. It's a Malthusian thing. But technology has brought us through, and fossil fuel, coal and oil, are important parts of the technology that has put us in a much better world than it has ever been. Everybody agrees discovering appropriate alternate forms of non-polluting energy sources will be a boon to humanity. Nobody disagrees on that. Preventing the degradation of the environment should be a high priority issue for humans, irrespective of their position on climate change. In other words, whether you believe it or not, mostly people, if you disagree on the climate, they say you don't care about the environment. That is not true, because we care about the environment equally, people on this side. And one other concession I have to make is that the world today is populated as never has been before. So whatever is the paleoclimate says this, or it was 100,000 years ago, that's a little, that's on weaker legs because we never have had such a population. And so that should be reckoned with sensitivity to the presence of 8 billion humans on the planet today, which never has been. So all these, we recognize all these. So now let's look at the overarching philosophy of the alarmists, activists, and press, the consensus myth, and the opposing sides of the debate. What are the perils of opposing? Oops. So one of the things that the alarmist hysteria is justified, and I feel particularly irate about activists weaponizing children and indoctrinating in schools. And I have grandchildren, so I worry about that. And also, as I will show in a minute, psychological well-being and expectations of upcoming generations are being distorted negatively. And so let's start with this young lady who's become very world famous. If I can get her to start. There.
This is all wrong.
She's 15 years
I
old.
shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams, my childhood with your empty words. And yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is the money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe.
So this young lady suffered a lot of depression thinking about polar bears and all the extinction, and the only way she could come out of it was by fighting back like this. She was 15 years old, and I don't know, you can figure out whether you want your grandchildren to be this way or not. And then you can, here are some headlines from some papers to further emphasize the point. So if you don't know what shrinks are in US, their psychiatrists are called shrinks. They shrink your head. That's what they're called. So these are all very latest news. Environmental burden of Generation Z. Here, climate, people are saying maybe I shouldn't have children, and all these kind of very grave decisions. And I don't want my grandchildren to get caught up in any of this. And that's one of the reasons I'm taking this position. Now, what happens to the activists? Okay, professional activists decide what is good for humanity and justify any action, much like religious fundamentalists. They have convinced themselves that the end justifies the means. Activists create mocked-up images to justify their claims. And interestingly, they accept funding from industries who benefit from their action. Example, wind industry, windmill. Media thrives on gloom and doom predictions and their presumed validation based the unassailable side, okay? Validation, okay, anyway. Presumed validation based on unassailable science. They say the science is unassailable. Then you have these pictures like this to scare people. And a university professor, I will say more about it, who said that's not true, who did the survey and found that not to be true, the university fired her. And I'll get clear in a minute. And then, of course, this has nothing to do with climate change per se. It's about plastics, but still, they create these pictures to create scare. I don't know if the bird could have eaten that much plastic and I think it is a dissected bird with plastic stuffed in there. Now, of all the people, the Pope of alarmism is Al Gore, one of the most bombastic for people, and I think I've changed the word hyperbole into hyper-Gore, at least for climate change. So he won a Nobel Prize in 2007 for his climate alarm. And then he made a movie where he made very many predictions that by this time we would have all been dead if his predictions came true. But I'd like to introduce another character who wrote a recent book called Factfulness. This is Hans Rosling. He's a global health professor. If you've not seen his videos on the internet, he's got a lot of graphic demonstrating how the population changes, everything graphically. So it's a very beautiful, if you don't know of him, I would look him up on YouTube and enjoy his videos. And his latest book in 2018, 10 Reasons We Are Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. So it's a very optimistic message from every side of how much better the world looks today, despite what the press says, despite what the activists say, despite what anybody says. We live in a better world, and I believe that. So this book, this is, I don't have to tell you who that is. He says, one of the most important books I've ever read, an indispensable guide to thinking clearly about the world. So that's the man I'm going to quote now. It goes like this. This is from his book, chapter 4. So this is what the dialogue is. That's what Al Gore said to me at the start of our first conversation about how to teach climate change. So by the by, both Bill Gates and Rosling believe man-made climate change. So it's not like they are from the opposing side. They are on the side of where Gore is coming from, but yet you can hear. This is when he met at a TED conference, okay, where Al Gore asked him to help him use the technique, the gap minder bubble graphs that Rosling had popularized. So he said, I agreed with him completely. Swift action on climate change was needed, but I couldn't agree to what he had asked. Gore continues to press his case for fearful animated bubbles beyond expert forecast over several more conversations until I finally close the discussion. Okay? So it's a convenient fear. Still, the volume keeps getting racked up. This is Rosling saying, I'm not saying that. And he's the believer. Many activists convinced it is important global issue have made it a practice to blame everything on climate, to make it a single cause of all of the global problems. If the temperature goes up, it is climate change. If the temperature goes down, it is climate change. If temperature doesn't change, it is climate change. That's what the whole scenario is. So the key point is, according to Rosling, fear plus urgency makes for stupid, drastic decision with unpredictable side effects. Climate change is too important for that. So that's a position, although I don't agree completely with the anthropogenic climate change. This is where my position too. So there is a myth that it is often quoted that 97% scientists, I don't know, they believe in human-caused global warming. So these are surveys that they send out to people who have published papers. So that means it is only people who are funded to publish papers that you survey. And then the definition of scientists is very nebulous. I mean, I don't know how you define a scientist. And as you can see, expertise in climate science goes up. You believe more and more because, oops, surprise, funding talks. Deepastambam Mahascharyam Enikim Kritanam Banam, as Nambiar said. So it's not surprising that you would get these results, because what is the definition of scientist? And many of the contrarians have been debarred from doing science. So they cannot publish, they cannot speak. And so this is a trumped up survey. Now, answers can be biased depending on how you ask the question. Do you believe in climate change? Yes, everybody does. Do you believe in man-made climate change? Maybe. Maybe means yes. So the 97% also refers to number of papers rather than the number of scientists. So you can take all that, but it's a good slogan for publicity, and that's what it's being used as. So quickly, who are the two sides in the climate debate? One of them are generally labeled as deniers or skeptics or called fools. These are many retired climate scientists, including several Nobel laureates, who do not need government funds. So they are comfortable, but they speak, but they're not given a forum. Disenfranchised academics denied funding or driven out of the academic system. There have been several people, because the universities find it inconvenient to have people on faculty who oppose climate change, because the funding agencies, the government funding agencies look down upon having such people. These people are mocked, derided, shamed, and threatened sometimes by the louder side, because the right side is louder. The members are scattered and an unfunded constituency. They get funding from some companies, sometimes some major things, but there are some very eminent scientists. Interestingly, Wikipedia does not now give an equal voice to people who do not agree with the anthropogenic global warming. So the discussion has been cut off. On the other side are these, what we call as, consensusists or alarmists or catastrophists. These are climatologists, etc. I don't know how you define any scientists who calls themselves climatologists. He's a climatologist who receive profusion of government funding, and they write all the IPCC reports. They're fully backed and funded by IPCC. They will not engage with the other side because they got their goal made. Also on this side are academic institutions who discourage, dismiss dissenters for funding reasons. The university looks bad. Activists with loud voices and resources to alarm the public, as you saw in the previous two slides. And there's press who likes these stories of gloom and doom. And there are some industries who stand to benefit from investment into their sectors. For example, wind and solar panel people oppose the people on the left. So what happens to deniers and skeptics? What happened? Okay, man-made global warming don't tolerate dissent. There's $1 billion at stake, says Timothy Ball, who received death threats for questioning man-made. In 2014, 7 bullets were shot into the walls of University of Alabama, Huntsville, offices where Dr. Roy Spencer and John Christie worked. Virtually all climate research now simply assumes climate change is almost entirely human caused. And if scientists has a theory about it being even partly naturally caused, he or she can forget about getting research funds. So what happened? Here are some examples. I already showed you that one about polar bears. The professor was fired. Australian academic muzzled and journal papers altered. The university departments don't want their scientists to publish anything that doesn't go along with the party line. So people are afraid. And then speaking out, the system makes impossible for scientists to take public stands against anthropogenic global warming. Their funding opportunities shut off, their credibility and character is smeared, and their safety often compromised. This is from an article which I've given a link here. According to Science Everything, if you want everything you know about climate change is wrong, the title is provocative, but it's worth the read. It gives the whole history of the evolution of the movement. And I've excerpted some lines from that. How much funding? It is estimated that 150 billion was spent on climate change and green energy subsidies from 2009 to 2015. And here's some comparisons. Estimates of the investment required to achieve low carbon transition range from 1.6 trillion to 3.8 trillion annually. So the annually is important, from here to 2050. For perspective, we could end world hunger with a fraction of the amount and have plenty left over to fight malaria and cancer. So those are some funding perspectives. So now we'll move to the science, and then I will talk about IPCC as I see it. So So here's a graph that shows the concentration of CO2, the global temperature, and the sea level. And they push this as there is a correlation, but it's hard to tell which goes up first and which doesn't go up. So correlation is not causation. Which rises first? It's hard to tell. And as you'll see at the extreme right, CO2 has shot up. This is time in thousands of years. I don't know how accurate these are. There have been periods earlier when CO2 was higher, but it has stopped. Whereas neither temperature nor sea levels have risen. Now, you can always argue that it takes time after the CO2 gets in the atmosphere, then it's got heat and the oceans absorb the heat. So you can find any number of excuses, but this is one of the sore points for me. Climate dynamics are not well understood. Other sources of heat. Now there's a new paper saying that the mantle of the earth, sometimes when things move, the magnetic poles are shifting, as you know, because the internal movement of the earth's core. So there are some people who are now starting to say that there's some geothermal things coming from inside the core of the earth. Could that could raise the temperature of the oceans, and when the ocean warms up, the dissolved CO2 moves to the atmosphere, and so you could get an increase in CO2. Another interesting fact is temperature rise over the last 2 decades has been slower relative to CO2 rise. I mean, it's just the predictions. It's not. They said it's going to happen tomorrow, and it's been somewhat surprising that the effect has not been seen. You can always argue it takes time. Then, of course, the other thing people don't understand is, you people from BRC should understand this. You're dealt with HVL and TVL, half-value layers. So the absorption of radiation, including heat is exponential. So doubling does not cause twofold. It's not linear. Twofold rise in temperature. So some people believe that the concentration that we have now is, as far as radiation effects go, it is already saturated. In other words, any further increase would not increase the greenhouse effect. There's some calculation based on that out of Princeton. And of course, similar warm periods have occurred. So now if you don't look at the CO2, now all this data is paleo data, climate data, and maybe we didn't have so many people on the earth, but you can see these peaks here that have happened. And I don't know what the CO2 levels were at that time over the last 1,000 years, but this is not unusual, at least according to this graph. All this is looking back and calculating from tree rings and any number of ice cores and things like that. So everything to be taken with a pinch of salt. Now, some people argue that increased CO2 levels are beneficial to humanity. Okay, there are several studies that indicate that increased CO2 is good for plants, and it may alleviate global hunger. That can counteract deforestation, combat CO2-induced climate change in its own way. So it's a self-limiting feedback process. So here's an example. Cotton grows 60% double CO2 and warmed by 7 degrees. These are a lot of greenhouse experiments. So there's another positive side if you want to count it. So now IPCC, it's the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, an organization with a bias, that's my statement. And the panel, as I will show in the video, stated focus of studying human component of the global warming climate change. Countries nominate scientists who already believe fully in man-made climate change. Final reports are edited by policymakers to suit political ends. Now, when you set up a thing like that, if you take a goose cannot lay a chicken's egg. It will lay a goose egg, and that's what this will tell you.
So let me take you back to the beginning of the IPCC. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was established in the UN by figures such as Maurice Strong. At the very beginning of that organization, if you look into their official papers, there is a statement of what they're about. What is their purpose? What are they trying to do? And it becomes very apparent that they're only interested in looking for the human causation behind the climate. And consequently, all the funding for any research into climate was then only channeled towards anybody who was looking for a human component. Well, that tells you something. Is it truly scientific? It poses as scientific, and it amasses huge amounts of science, but at its root, it is a political organization. Now let's just for a moment examine their process. Now their process is quite good, but there's a fundamental flaw to it, which exposes this whole issue of whether it's reliable or not. And that is this: they've divvied up the science of climate change. And so you've got a section dealing with sea level rise, a section dealing with polar bears, another one for glaciers, another one for the North Pole, etc., etc. And so these genuine top-class scientists in these different fields are called upon to produce their papers on their particular area of expertise. And then those papers are all looked at, and then they try to summarize them to get a sort of feel for what's happening in that area. But as usual, as you'd expect with good scientists who are looking into the future, they're going to suggest a range of options. But now in the IPCC process, before it goes to print, there's a summary that is prepared for policymakers. And that's the bit that goes out. That's the bit that is communicated to the press and the press comment on. And this is done not by the scientists. This is done by an overlay of, I'm going to call them, global warming activists. They are not the true scientists who prepared the papers. And they cherry pick the more extreme response. Now, historically, what does that lead to? Some of these scientists throw up their hands in horror and say, that's not what I said. And some of them have resigned in protest because the final statement did not represent the truth about the science. Now, I know that the IPCC has been forced to improve. And over the years, they are improving. And over the years, they are taking into account divergence of views. And they're also taking into account the degree of probability. But it's still, at the end of the day, a political statement.
So going further on the idea, generally, I think from my perspective, there's a difference between, the difference is that of one that is between scientists and lawyers. Generally, scientists gather data, analyze it, and explain existing observations and make verifiable predictions. And is missing, verifiable prediction. Lawyers always decide what they want to prove and gather supporting evidence while discarding evidence against their case. IPCC, is it a government-established law firm to prove the case for man-made CO2-based climate change? I don't know, I wonder. And this is from an IPCC report. They claim, although as in any developing, there is a minority opinion which we have not been able to accommodate. The peer reviewers helped ensure high degree of consensus among authors and reviewers. This is all within the same club. Thus, the assessment is authoritative statement of views of international scientific community. So that is a selected international scientific community, right? Now, let's look at the climate models. There have been so many climate models developed, and the scientists, up until at least 2016, I don't know if it's any better today, this is an article from Science, they did not share what they were doing. That is not usual in science. Sharing is one of the most important things in science that keeps everything on par. So they all go to their corners, they have their secret recipes, and they make models with that. So here's some indication of a model. This is called the RPC 8.5, the worst case model, that you can see here are the measured temperatures. And here are all the predictions. They have, I think there are 73 models that all this variation, then they average it. Interestingly, there's only one model from Russia that predicts this properly, but they don't use that because it's Russian. In any case, so this is the status of the uncertainties in the modeling process. So here again is a summarized view of the models. This is the predictions going into 2050, 2025. And now we're talking about 2100, 2050. which I think most of us on this talk will not live to see. I won't, and I know for that for sure, but it is like ghosts everywhere. So, and here's where we are now. And this is what is predicted, and this is what the observations of balloon data sets and things like that show. So the models are way off. And yet they always, IPCC always uses the worst case model. They use this model, probably 8.5. Sorry, the previous graph. So here are some RPs, RCP stands for representative concentration pathways. And as you can see, here are some different model predictions. They get all this. And if we give it to the activists, they will make everything based on RCP 8.5. So there's a serious shortcoming to climate models. It is acknowledged that it neglects any cloud. So what they do is divide the globe into squares or rectangles or whatever, and then do calculation based on these rectangles. So far, nobody has found a way to account for cloud effects, and clouds usually make all these predictions more moderate. So that kind of never comes up. And they've made a lot of predictions over time, and I will share some with you. Bad predictions are made and conveniently forgotten if they're wrong. Very few of Gore's predictions from his movie in 2006 have come true. Every weather event is blamed on climate to make it a single cause of all of the global problems, as Rosling said in a few slides earlier. Here's the problem. People who believe in ghosts see them everywhere. Once you're convinced there are ghosts, anything that happened that you cannot explain is because of a ghost. So that's the thing. So let's hear this gentleman. I'm in touch with him. I correspond with him. His name is John Robson, and he's got a very nice website here, Climate Discussion Nexus. That's got lots of videos making various points.
According to top climate scientist James Hansen, we have only 10 years to act decisively and avert catastrophe.
That was September 14, 2006. So we had until 2016, which was 4 years ago. Was there a climate catastrophe and I missed it?
Australia's chief climate scientist says the world has only 5 years to avoid disastrous warming.
December 4th, 2009. We had only 5 years left, 11 years ago.
And a senior Australian government climate advisor says Adelaide could be out of water as soon as the end of next year.
As Gertrude Stein might say, interesting if true. That prediction was made back in 2008, so next year would have been 2009. Still waiting on that one. The taps in Adelaide are still working.
NASA climate experts have predicted the Arctic Ocean could be ice-free within 6 years.
But that one is from December 12, 2007, and the forecast was for Arctic sea ice to be gone by the end of summer 2012. Somehow the Arctic is still covered in ice.
Alarms about the death of Arctic sea ice actually go back a long way. In 1954, the ice was predicted to be gone by 2004. In 1972, it was predicted to be gone by 2000. In 2007, it was predicted to be gone by 2013. In 2013, they said it would be gone by 2014 or 2015. In 2012, the final collapse of Arctic sea ice was predicted by 2016, according to Cambridge University polar expert Dr. Peter Wadhams. And then in 2016, the deadline was extended again, this time to 2017.
So don't tell me, let me guess. We're about to hear another prediction of the imminent disappearance of Arctic sea ice.
The snows on Mount Kilimanjaro will be gone within 10 years.
Al Gore made that prediction in 2007. The same Al Gore whose global warming movie gets shown to school kids all over the world. So it was headline news in 2019 when someone glanced upward and saw that, lo and behold, The snow on Kilimanjaro is still the snow on Kilimanjaro.
The US Secretary of State says there's only 10 years before climate change will be catastrophic and irreversible, and a threat to human security, global stability, and American national security.
Make that former US Secretary of State, because it was John Kerry, October 16, 2009, meaning last year was the end of the world, which I just mentioned in case you missed it.
The United Nations Environment Program predicts there will be 50 million climate refugees within 2 years.
Yes, but that one dates back to May 2008. And that's when UNEP said there would be a worldwide climate-driven refugee crisis by 2010, which curiously was the start of the most prosperous decade the world has ever experienced, including dramatic reductions in absolute poverty among the world's poorest. In fact, this constant bombardment of the public with nightmare forecasts would be funny if it wasn't also leading to some truly harmful consequences like rising eco-anxiety among children and youth, and a relentless push for draconian economic policies that will hurt poor people the worst.
And then, of course, there are always some interesting findings that pop up here and there. So we don't understand the climate as much as we think we do. Some atolls are growing. I mean, according to them, I think Maldives should have been underwater by now, and it's still there. So why use RPC 8.5? This is a paper from Nature. Stop using worst-case scenarios for climate warming as most likely outcome. More realistic baselines make better policy. So this is from this paper, which you can look up if you like. And here's projecting into 2100. And these are the worst case scenario using this model. And that's what they go by. And if some of the other models, reversal of some current policies, you can still be within 4 degrees in 2100, not even now. I think that as long as in our lifetime, I don't think we're going to see much of a change. And the likely, given current policies, it's in this region. So these predictions are just whatever they are, and they use always the worst case scenarios to cause fear. The activists take these and make the worst case scenarios. So now let's look at US climate treaties and their impact, and what do alarmists want, and a few other technologies that are coming up. So according to Paris, there's a Paris Accord of 2015, which was loudly celebrated. It is the third treaty after Rio. The first one was in Rio, the second was in Kyoto, and where it gathered all the countries of the world and strongly urged allocate 100 billion a year climate finance for developing countries by 2020, with a commitment for further finances by 2025. This has just been empty. And let me tell you, this is I'm not a Trump fan, but you can find some things that one can agree with, even with Trump. So let me run this video.
One of the hottest years on record is among the hottest years recorded.
The hottest year on record.
Another hot year. Global warming. What will we do about that? Politicians from most every country promised to deal with it by signing something called the Paris Climate Agreement.
A historic climate agreement in Paris.
But when President Trump took office, he said,
the United States will withdraw.
What? We will withdraw? We alone?
President Trump isolated the United States with his reckless and indefensible decision.
My neighbors in New York agree with that. And so do most of the media.
A lot at stake, potentially for the planet.
Really? I bet they don't even know what was in the agreement. I didn't.
Paris Accord was somewhere between a farce and a fraud.
Manhattan Institute senior fellow Orrin Cass is one of the few people who've actually read the Paris Agreement, and also the commitment set in by every country.
You don't even have to mention greenhouse gases in your commitment if you don't want to. You send in any piece of paper you want. We're going to staple them all together, and we're going to call that the Paris Accord. Everyone sent in a piece of paper and they stapled it together and held it up and said, this is amazing.
China has made a major commitment.
So what's in the commitments that every country made?
India has ratified the Paris Climate Accord, committing the world's fastest growing economy to limit carbon dioxide emissions.
What you find is they either pledged to do exactly what they were already going to do anyway, or pledged even less than that. China, for instance, said, we pledge to reach peak emissions by about 2030. Well, the United States government had already done a study to guess when Chinese emissions would peak, and their guess was about 2030.
Peak doesn't mean stop, it just means stop increasing.
That's right. So in fact, China promised they will continue increasing their emissions for some time to come.
And yet,
China was actually one of the better pledges. India made no pledge to limit their emissions at all. They pledged only to become more efficient, but they proposed to become efficient less quickly than they're already becoming more efficient. So their pledge was to slow down. My favorite was Pakistan, whose pledge was to reach a peak at some point after which to begin reducing emissions. And so you can staple those together and you could say we now have a global agreement, but what you have is an agreement to do nothing. And if anything, you've gone backwards because whereas in the past you could have criticized countries and said, hey, why aren't you doing anything? Now we have an agreement that says, in fact, we will applaud you for doing nothing.
We came together around the strong agreement the world needed.
Obviously, President Obama got a lot of political mileage out of that, but the climate didn't get much at all. The one country that showed up in Paris with a very costly and ambitious target was the United States. So President Obama took all the zero commitments from everybody else, but threw in a really expensive one for us.
super expensive. Obama pledged to reduce American emissions by a quarter. Of course, it's true that,
Okay, I think that's enough of that. So what do alarmists want? But what do they ignore? I think I'm going to run a little late. I seek your indulgence, please. They want 100% renewable energy by elimination of fossil fuels, zero carbon rapidly, go to zero carbon. They want wind, solar, and geothermal. No oil, not gas, no hydroelectric, never nuclear. Is that dream achievable? And I will expand on that a little bit. And what it means to the developing world. For the first time since agriculture-based civilization began 10,000 years ago, majority of the humankind is no longer poor or vulnerable to falling into poverty. Indeed, more than half of the world is now middle class or richer. This is the truth. And do you want to disrupt that? As this guy is Lomberg, he's an economist. He believes in climate change, but he thinks that we are going the wrong way. More energy equals less poverty. Cheap mitigation should solve many of the problems. What he says is that instead of going into this frenzy mode, there are other ways we could do it cheaply. So what are the other energy realities? Poverty alleviation, of course, is energy intensive. And I ask myself often, does a mother in Africa or rural India in Himachal Pradesh care about global warming? Or do they care about lighting the next meal, fire for the next meal for a starving family? And what all these are priorities of wealthy West mean little to the poor world. Let's look at the energy balance. And they don't want coal, agreed, because it makes a lot of greenhouse gas. Oil, a bit better. Now, natural gas is almost half the emission potential, okay? They don't want that. Biomass is another failure. Bioethanol, biodiesel. To make ethanol using corn, they took away all the corn from the market, causing world hunger. Hydropower, it's disruption of nature, so we don't want that. Nuclear energy, we don't want that. All we want is wind and solar. So what does Bill Gates say about it? Beyond transportation, fossil fuels are now used to produce steel, cement, concrete, plastics, which are all vital for continued growth of the developing world. They are also needed for solar, and interestingly, even to make the solar panels and the windmills, you still need these things, cement and support and everything. Will solar and wind support these needs? Let Bill Gates tell you.
So a lot of people are very optimistic, as you know, with wind and solar, the renewables costs coming down, the battery costs are coming down. Do you think that's enough, or do you think
that
that
is so
disappointing. I mean, really. The Václav yesterday, he said, okay, here's Tokyo, 27 million people. You have 3 days of a cyclone basically every year. It's 22 gigawatts rate over 3 days. You know, tell me what battery solution is going to sit there and provide that power. I mean, let's not joke around. You're multiple orders of magnitude, you know, $100 per kilowatt hour. That's nothing. That doesn't solve the reliability problem. And remember, electricity is 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. Whenever we came up with this term clean energy, I think it screwed up people's minds because they didn't, now they don't understand. I was at this conference in New York, I won't name it. And they were saying, all these financial guys got on stage and said, oh, we're going to rate companies in terms of their CO2 output. We're going to say this company puts out a lot of CO2 and financial markets are magical. And all of a sudden the CO2 will stop being emitted. And I was like, okay, how do you make steel? Do you guys on Wall Street, do you have something in your desks that makes steel? What? Where's the fertilizer, cement, plastic? Where's it going to come from? You know, do planes fly through the sky because of some number you put on a spreadsheet? So the madness of this.
So that the point is made. So I'll proceed.
So a lot of people are very optimistic, as you know.
And let's look at the energy problem from a different perspective. While green energy appears attractive, its problems are shrouded in optimism. Green energy has its own set of problems.
Have you ever heard of unobtainium? It's the magical energy mineral found on the planet Pandora in the movie Avatar. It's a fantasy in a science fiction script. But environmentalists think they found it here on Earth in the form of wind and solar power. They think all the energy we need can be supplied by building enough wind and solar farms and enough batteries. The simple truth is that we can't, nor should we want to, not if our goal is to be good stewards of the planet. To understand why, consider some simple physics realities that aren't being talked about. All sources of energy have limits that can't be exceeded. The maximum rate at which the sun's photons can be converted to electrons is about 33%. Our best solar technology is at 26% efficiency. For wind, the maximum capture is 60%. Our best machines are at 45%. So we're pretty close to wind and solar limits. Despite PR claims about big gains coming, there just aren't any possible. And wind and solar only work when the wind blows and the sun shines, but we need energy all the time. The solution, we're told, is to use batteries. Again, physics and chemistry make this very hard to do. Consider the world's biggest battery factory, the one Tesla built in Nevada. It would take 500 years for that factory to make enough batteries to store just 1 day's worth of America's electricity needs. This helps explain why wind and solar currently still supply less than 3% of the world's energy, after 20 years and billions of dollars in subsidies. Putting aside the economics, if your motive is to protect the environment, you might want to rethink wind, solar, and batteries because, like all machines, they're built from non-renewable materials. Consider some sobering numbers. A single electric car battery weighs about half a ton. Fabricating one requires digging up, moving, and processing more than 250 tons of earth somewhere on the planet. Building a single 100 megawatt wind farm can power 75,000 homes requires some 30,000 tons of iron ore and 50,000 tons of concrete, as well as 900 tons of non-recyclable plastics for the huge blades. To get the same power from solar, the amount of cement, steel, and glass needed is 150% greater. Then there's the other minerals needed, including elements known as rare earth metals. With current plans, the world will need an incredible 200 to 2,000% increase in mining for elements such as cobalt, lithium, and dysprosium, to name just a few. Where is all this stuff going to come from? Massive new mining operations, almost none of it in America. Some imported from places hostile to America, and some places we all want to protect. Australia's Institute for Sustainable Futures cautions that a global gold rush for energy materials will take miners into remote wilderness areas that have maintained high biodiversity because they haven't yet been disturbed.
Okay, I think we'll move on from
Have
that.
you ever heard of unobtainium?
So then, of course, they're proposing new technologies, none of which is developed. Carbon capture technologies, lots of exciting proposal, but still in development. Reducing emission of CO2 from chimneys, that's scrubbers, they are very expensive. That's what they're not being put in use so far. Then there are some proposal to suck CO2 from the atmosphere. I don't know how they're going to do it. Put a huge pipe and start sucking down the CO2. And there is a proposals like geoengineering, injecting aerosols and chemicals into the troposphere, either microparticles, nanoparticles that scatter the light and decrease the energy coming in, or sulfur dioxide. This proposal is on table. And this is now going back to acid rain. If you put sulfur dioxide when it rains, it comes down as sulfuric acid. The errors, if you make any errors in this, it'd be catastrophic. So guilt and atonement with climate colonialism. This is a statement that came out just last week. Global rich must cut their carbon footprint 97% to stay off climate change, UN says. It's not going to happen. America, nobody's doing anything, not even Gore himself. So here's a look at the global carbon emission for 2018, and it shows China bigger than equal to Europe plus USA, but we get all our stuff from them. They make everything for us. And India is also quite large. But if you look at the real story, here's per capita emissions. Couple of points to note. Here, India doesn't even come on the chart because we have so many people. We need to use energy. The biggest culprit is still USA. And even here, what I would like you to note is that it's plateaued. So energy efficiencies have kicked in. So that should already reduce some of the emission, but still it is not enough. As the UN Secretary said, I think in USA, we all have too many cars. There are no drastic measures for us to stop driving. We just do whatever we want and tell the rest of the world you need to shape up. So carbon offloading is another thing that's happening. To meet the Paris Climate Treaty, EU countries are offshoring carbon-intensive industries to developing countries. Germany has decommissioned a brand new coal plant just built 5 years ago, shut down all its nuclear reactors, leading to higher energy prices, but it seems to be working so far. And of course, here's a paper from Nature. It says, Europe's Green Deal offshores environmental damage to other nations. This is importing millions of tons of crops and meat each year. And as you can see, between these years, biodiesel production, they import things, meat and milk export, oil seeds. All these come from other European, offload the carbon. And here's a major graphic, and look at the presentation is being recorded, that the use of fertilizers and other things in the developing countries is going up because Europe is importing all these things. So it almost sounds like climate colonialism in some ways. Now, what about India? This is a lady, Aarti Khosla. Here's the link to her plan, Climate Trends. And I'm not going to play a video, but here's the statement. Khosla thinks it's important for journalists in developing countries not just borrow from the global narrative on climate change, but to also create a nationally relevant narrative based on issues of local importance. She points to how increased coverage from point of view of a developing country can help set the agenda ahead of crucial discussions in venues like the United Nations. So that's a view that she's proposing, and that's something that I would like to emphasize too. The link is here. You can listen to her whole speech, and we need to think not from the global perspective, but from within. And actually, Modi recently inaugurated a huge solar farm. I think he's playing it right. Just go along and just, but we need to take care of India's needs before falling into these dream technologies. I think I'm getting close to the end, and here's a place for nuclear energy. And I just wanted to share this. This is for the atomic energy people, so I just do want to share this. Public perception as hazardous than other technologies. As I showed you a few graphs ago, the number of deaths compared to gas and all other operations is much less for nuclear. Shankar Narayanan and I have discussions about this, but there's a fear, radiation carcinogen, and radiation causes cancer, chemicals cause cancer too. So we cannot have the cake and eat it too. You're going to have to take risks somewhere. So loss of lives is significantly less than any other technology. Nuclear waste disposal is still an issue, but some solutions seem to be coming along. And I would like to raise you guys, the atomic energy people, thorium reactors, and I'll let this young lady tell you a little bit.
Hi everyone, this is Sina and you're watching Tech Paradise. One of the major differences between developed countries and ours is the pattern of energy use. They use a lot more to fuel their decadent lifestyle. And if we're to become the golden bird of the world again, we need to generate and consume a lot more power too. I know the fashionable thing to say nowadays is that we need to scale down our consumption of energy, live more sustainably, etc. But that's not going to happen. Neither China nor us are going to sacrifice development at the altar of carbon. Currently, we depend on coal to produce the bulk of our energy. And that's not great. Whether you care about climate change or not, the quality of air we breathe affects everyone. But what if I told you that one of our great sages had peered through the mists of time and given us a blueprint for clean, plentiful energy? Let's talk physics. This is a uranium-235 atom. It's quite big and unwieldy and has two major forces acting on it. The strong force which attracts neutrons and protons together, and the electromagnetic force which repulses protons away. This strong force has a very limited area of influence. So when uranium-235 reaches out to grab a neutron, the electrostatic force rips it down the middle. The fission products zip away from each other at 3% of the speed of light. The process also creates 3 additional neutrons. In order that they don't fly away, we have to slow them down. And this is accomplished by surrounding the fuel with water. These slow neutrons then fizz other uranium-235 atoms. The process repeats and we have a chain reaction on our hands. And remember how temperature just means kinetic energy of particles? Well, the fuel starts to heat up and this heat is carried away by the water to generate steam. The steam turns a turbine and the turbine fairy then creates electricity. This process is used in almost every nuclear plant around the world. The only problem is that uranium-235 comes along with non-fissile uranium-238, which constitutes 99.3% of the mix. So we have to enrich uranium-235 to around 3% to be able to use it with regular water. In India, we decided we didn't want to go through that process. So we use heavy water instead of light water, which got us and our friends in trouble with the United States a couple of times. But that's a different story. India has another problem. We only have 2% of the world's reserves of uranium. And remember, only 0.7% of it is the good stuff. We do, however, have a lot of thorium. Almost a third of the world's total supply is to be found in the form of monazite in the sands of Kerala. Thorium is not fissile, but it is fertile. When you bombard it with a neutron, it undergoes beta decay twice to become uranium-233, which, you guessed it, is fissile. This kind of reactor is called a breeder reactor because it produces more fissile material than you initially started with.
So what she is recommending is that because nuclear energy, the name nuclear energy is associated with the bomb and the cancers, we really scare away from it. So she thinks that we should paint all these, change the radiation symbol and paint all these reactors and to look more friendly and just rename it as fission energy. So it takes away the nuclear connotation of danger from it. It can be made friendly. So that's the message here. So I'm just going to leave you with some points to ponder. Is there a real problem looming ahead? Think about it. Is the reaction fostered by the climate change alarm is justifiable? Is the alarm of catastrophe based on scientific facts or political considerations? Is the alarm a Western fantasy based on biased science that can derail global growth? Is the world being goaded into actions that may set back other crying needs of the developing world? Would some of the novel solutions be more catastrophic than what lies ahead now? So those are some points that I'd like you to think about, and I'll end it on an Indian note as follows. Thus, I have explained to you this knowledge that is more secret than all secrets. Ponder over it deeply and do as you wish. So with that, I conclude.
So thank you, Dr. Ramabhadran. Now forum is open for questions. Anybody want to ask questions? So you told me that global warming is not as dangerous as we expect.
Yes.
So my question is that in Kerala, I am from Kerala. See, we see in that Arabian Sea become very rough and very, very dangerous. Lot of super cyclonic storms are coming in Arabian Sea, which we never expected to have.
Yeah.
See, now Arabian Sea, every year we are getting storms. We had a cyclonic storm. We had big severe storms.
Yeah.
So people say this storm in Arabian Sea is due to the climate change or global or warming of Arabian Sea.
Yeah.
Is it? Can we correlate this with the climate change?
That's my thing about ghosts. We've been warned about ghosts. Now you see them everywhere. If you look at the IPCC reports, a lot of these things, the climate is an average of 30 years, and we've been doing this thing for the last 40 years maybe. And we don't. There are records. If you go deep and look in the records, things have been happening. But now that we have sensitized, anything that happens is global warming. So that's my position on that. You can debate because they create, attribution, adducing. Oh, yeah, it's like if you've been.
But one thing is that the climate in Kerala is changing. That no doubt about that. We are not having
climate is always changing.
We are not having a winter. We are not having any very winter in Kerala. We used to get winter in January, February. Now everything become warm now. What is the reason for this?
If you ask your grandfather, maybe there are periods like that too. So what I'm saying is that people are inferring everything back. Like I said, you've been walking the street for 20 years at night, midnight, and somebody, Sadguru or somebody convinced you there are ghosts living there, and from next day on you're going to be looking for ghosts. So there's a lot of that going on, like Rosling said. Everything is attributed. So things have been changing. And what's happened is humans think they want to maintain nature as it is to their liking. I don't know if that's possible. Things will change. And whether it's due to man-made climate change, that's for you to decide.
I am Chandrajudan from Bombay.
Yes, sir.
It's a very nice, interesting lecture. So one problem has been pestering me. People say man-made problems and nature. But I understand that humans are also part of nature. So
yes.
What way man-made is different from nature? It should be part of nature, is it not?
Yeah, it should be. But then, the distinction here is, that way we are causing our own evolution. But the debate here is that are you going to make changes that affect the livelihoods and economies of people based on something, a correlation that some people have observed and honed in on, spend lots of money making points, making predictions that scare children? Is that worth it? Is there a more saner way to go at it? Because the temperature has not moved up all that much as they had predicted. Of course, there are always excuses. You can always look back and say, oh, it's because of this. And I wonder if some Josin in Palakkad will do a better job. So yes, you're right. That's a technical argument. Man is a part of. So whatever man-made is natural. The distinction is that how much is it coming from our activities and how much could it be natural, and do we know that fully? To take all this drastic actions and crying and screaming and all that.
And the so-called disasters are also the nature's way of cleaning, because in connection with there was a flood in heavy rains and flood in Andhra. The Tungabhadra river rose up to 100 meters, and it flooded that Raghavendra Swami Madam with all silt and everything. In that context, people were telling every 100 years this phenomenon happens, and the entire area is washed clean. Similarly, when the tsunami struck the Chennai coast, the Kuvam River, which would have been humanly impossible to clean, it was completely cleaned by the tsunami waters. So there is a view that these things are natural, nature's way of cleaning. Otherwise, it is humanly impossible.
Yeah. No, there are always positive things like the plant growth I mentioned. The globe is greening. Yeah. So it's a very controversial issue. We should think about it. We should have debates. But if one side has already captured the thing and they're saying that it's going to happen, then there is a problem. It is not science. It is political science. It's one side has already won the battle with money.
Actually, I liked whether it is scientific forum or a law firm. That difference is very fine line.
Yeah.
About IPCC, you remark that was a very novel concept for. It was very interesting for me.
One simple thing, is it somehow linked with the political leaning? Is it that Republicans are skeptics and Al Gore is a fall guy because he is a mole in the Republican camp? Is that so?
That is correct. Generally, Republicans are lukewarm or almost cold on man-made climate change, whereas the Democrats, especially some of the Congress people, like there's a lady called Ocasio-Cortez, she's jumping up and down. We got 10 more years, otherwise the problem will come or something like that. So generally, yes, Democrats. Now with Biden coming back, he's going to put more money into that. There's nothing wrong in inventing new technologies, like Bill Gates just said. There's nothing wrong. He's investing a lot of money into technologies, but we have to wait for something to mature before we can abandon the current technologies. The gas is much better alternative to coal. There's no digging, there's nothing, but then they say there's fracking. So for everything, there is an objection. And when the renewables come, like I showed in the last video, it's gonna come with its own problems of disposal, material, mining, all those things. So what we need to do is have a technology as an alternative. Before you kill this horse, find another horse that'll carry you, and not just, let's stop carbon, let's stop everything, let's stop everything. So that it's not going to happen, because I think the people will revolt. I mean, energy prices are going up for people in Germany, and then they will change the government. So those are some of the things that are likely to happen. So I'm not saying that let's not find, like I said in the beginning, I'm not saying that let's not find better source of energy. In fact, some of the emissions have been coming down because we've made machines more efficient in many ways. Car engines are better and things like that. So we're getting around it, but is there such a hurry that we're going to fall dead? And also some people claim that the damage is already done, the carbon dioxide is going to stay there. If that's the case, and if you believe in the exponential law of absorption, then we have time. So it's how scared you want to get and how you want to scare your children. It's something we need to think about, but not jump up and down.
Gopalan from Hyderabad. So your lecture was nice. I just heard that Himalayas, the geologists tell that they are expecting a very huge earthquake. Anytime it may happen like that. So whether we should be prepared, in what way we should be prepared, or we expect, or what can be done to alleviate the difficulty.
So earthquakes, I mean, this climate change issue has not moved into the earthquake. Of course, volcanoes spew things and they can change the climate course. In fact, they could cause global cooling. That's happened many times before. But the Himalayas, of course, the glacier prediction by IPCC were shown to be wrong. There was a typo error or something like that. Got everybody scared.
Wow.
So whether earthquake, there are a lot of predictions like that. You know what? The magnetic field of the earth is moving all the time. And one day if it flips, so there are a lot of catastrophes waiting in areas we don't know. And also look back to 1900. There was no nuclear bomb, there was no nuclear energy. So technologies are coming, but is this time for such a knee jerk to scare everybody? And because, as Gore said earlier, I want to scare people. Well, where should we take? I think India is doing the right thing. You go along and then you do what